to have Washington or later Hamilton on your side. My goodness. Hello, everyone. Hi.
Hey,
there.
we're live.
Hi there. Oh, we're live, all right, baby.
1 minute early.
We are 1 minute early, so we won't start. With
did you name everything
great
right?
Stuff
Is
yet.
Everything?
It's probably close.
Or two.
I don't know if I got it all exactly right. It's hard to say.
Man, my Cedar Lane link disappeared off of my favorites.
Do. Hello, Danny Dynack, who I bet is watching on. She's a Facebooker, not a YouTuber. So, yeah.
It's working there.
So it's on there.
It's working there.
It's on there, yeah.
Here we go.
Come on, baby. Come on, baby. Oh,
Is this us?
it's totally going to work.
I think sometimes it just takes a minute.
Yeah. It's probably going to work. Hello there, Miss Jordan.
It took a while last time. Hey,
Holla! And the bonds? Across the way?
Is it raining at your house, too?
Is it raining at there? Yeah, we can see it. It's raining right there. But not bad. I think it's really pleasant. You were reluctant about coming outside.
It's a little cool. You know, I'm used to hotter weather. I'm a warm weather guy.
We live in this, we live
I think it's about
150
where
feet
you
apart.
Grew up. Not so much like...
Where'd you grow up? You grew up in a couple different places.
I grew up... My formative years were spent in an area where the coldest temperature I think it ever reached was like 76 in Nigeria, Africa. And so...
76?
It was typically in the hundreds all the time.
Oh my. Yeah, that's pretty high.
I'm not used to this cold weather.
Wait, somebody's birthday. Missy Schwartz. She says today.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you, Missy. Good for you. Danny actually says she does both, but tonight it's not YouTube. Is it coming? Is it not coming up?
It has not come up yet.
Try it again.
I will.
Oh, you know what?
Did you do the same thing as last time?
I did do the same thing as last time.
All right. So we got to shut this down and start over?
Well, it's still going on YouTube. So the only place that's on the website is the only place that it's not.
Okay.
I tell you what, I can fix that.
Okay.
If everybody will give me just a second and let me correct my error real quickly. I think I can fix it.
All right. Wait. It's Jordan's birthday too?
What?
Is that what
No
you
way.
said?
Is that right? Yeah, it sounds that way.
I think so.
That's pretty cool. So
Maybe she's saying that she does YouTube and Facebook too.
well, okay, so it's on YouTube, but it's not on the not on the one that's on the website. Yeah, and I think we've kind of gotten to the place now where most of the people that do it are doing it, from their own.
Yeah. I would have probably joined on Facebook, but
Yeah, me too.
it's easy to find that way.
Yeah, that's right. Here we go. Let's see here. If we do this, watch this little bit of magic, Rylan. You're going to be super impressed by this. Because all we're going to do is we're going to come right here.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just going to put this other link here. And that's going to work. And everybody will have access to it. See? Look, there we are.
That's the custom thumbnail. Great.
It's perfect. Perfect.
I love it.
All right, I should be able to place it now.
All right.
So
I'm checking.
All right, so enough of that. Sorry about that little bit of foolishness. We don't really talk about the process a lot of times, but there's about 9 or 10 different steps to get it in the right place, and occasionally
There we are.
Occasionally we forget one. So thank you for your patience with us. Oh, here it comes. Yeah.
Got it.
As we get in the right places and get live in all the right spots. So how you doing? You doing good?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. You know, with this rain, there's not going to be mosquitoes trying to get us.
No.
So there will be
So
no
we're safe
swatting
out
of
here.
each other tonight.
Mm-mm.
If you swat me tonight, I'll know you're just...
There could be a legitimate cause.
It seems unlikely.
You could blaspheme the Holy Spirit or something.
Oh, what a great little segue to what we're going to be doing today, my man.
Yeah. We had some prep material, or at least I did.
You did. I'll give you some prep material. Yeah. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. But that's actually going to be... We got some things we got to talk about first, though.
Okay.
Okay? All right, so we're doing some church history stuff, and we're getting into the phase where we're actually talking about our particular tradition that we share in the Churches of Christ, okay? And it's the tradition that Cedar Lane is born into, that we kind of... that's our tradition, I guess. That's the stream that we come from.
And last week we talked about Alexander Campbell.
Yeah, we did. Who is one of the major founders of our movement? Okay, and he was a pretty interesting cat. Okay, and his movement merged with another movement and kind of came smacking together. Okay, and so now we're going to back up. And we're going to get Barton W. Stone, okay, and get Barton Stone, and then we can because then we'll get to the place where we can talk about what it means for these things to kind of collide together.
Yeah.
Okay. Which was a little bit different. Okay. All right. So Barton Stone, he is born in. Oh man, he is like right around the same age as our country is. In fact, I'm trying to remember what his birth date was. I think it was like 1772 or something like that. Sounds about right. 1772. Okay, and so he's just a couple of years older than the Declaration of Independence, right? Which means his early formative years would have been in during the Revolutionary War.
Right.
So Barton Stone grows up, and he's a few years older. So that makes him a few years older than Alexander Campbell, by the way. Okay, because he was born in 88 or 78, 1778. Okay. And
he came
or
to
17.
America
He's born in
early
1788. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And so that makes him about 16 years older than Alexander Campbell is. Which is kind of good to remember because, 16 years may not sound like a lot to people in their older decades. But for people in the early... These were both young men when they kind of got involved with this movement. Okay, and I think it's important to remember that because when Alexander Campbell is really coming on the scene, okay, as a young 20-something who's getting into the ministry... Barton Stone is younger than I am, okay? But he's 15 years older than Campbell is, right? Okay. And so they're not they don't exactly line up as peers, okay? But they're close. They're very close, okay? And Barton Stone, I keep wanting to call him Bart. We talked about calling Alexander Campbell Al or Alex. Bart Stone. So Barton Stone comes into his own, okay, and there's a he comes under the influence. He's actually not that necessarily into religion initially, okay, but he comes under the influence of a Second Great Awakening preacher named James McCready, okay, and when he does, he's at a revival and he has a conversion experience. Okay.
So he's not real religious before that.
Right, but once he goes through this, he kind of is caught up in the Second Great Awakening. Now, we talked about the First Great Awakening being kind of like this revivalist movement, okay? And the Second Great Awakening is maybe like that even a little bit more.
Is he a teenager at that point? Or
he's like a late teen,
Late teens? Okay, early 20s.
And so what he decides to do is he decides to go into, and he begins to go on a path where he goes towards ministry, okay? Yeah. Which, at that time, still required some pretty significant credentialing, okay? And we'll talk about that again a little bit later, because it comes into play with the that little piece of writing that I sent you.
Yeah.
Okay. So he at the end of the 18th century, okay, the late 1700s, 1797, 1798. He's already begun working with a couple of churches in Kentucky, okay, Concord and famously Cane Ridge, and he's kind of doing something that's kind of like an itinerant sort of minister. He is also working in a Presbyterian system, okay, and so he is working within these kind of related churches, and meanwhile there is the movement of revivalism comes into that region very strongly, okay? And he is so impressed by this, okay, that he goes back to his churches and he reports some of the things that he's seen at some of the revivals that are around. And it's said that a revival immediately breaks out, okay? And particularly there at Cane Ridge, they make plans for it's called different things, okay? But if you want to find this, you want to do some reading about it, if you look for and search for the Cane Ridge Revival, this is a pretty well-known event during the Second Great Awakening. Okay. You know anything about Cane Ridge?
Not really. Is
I'm so glad about this. Huh?
Is it still there? Is it a church?
Yeah, there's a little meeting house still there. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Which really reminds me of a small old church that close to where I grew up. But we'll talk about that some other day. There is a little site there, and but what happens is they plan basically like a gospel meeting sort of thing. I mean, I don't even know if it's fair to say that they plan it or it kind of just happens, okay? Except for it takes a very particular kind of format. And that format is something that is imported from Scotland. Remember, like the Presbyterians have these Scottish roots, okay? And something had occurred in the last half century in Scotland among Presbyterians. And it was in Scotland. It was something of a resistance movement to like kind of clerical dominance, or authoritarian religion in some ways. And these things were called communion seasons, okay, or communion fairs, or something like that.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, it does sound like fun. Yeah, because it is half or communion festival, sometimes what it's called, or sacramental festival. Sometimes there's lots of words for this stuff. It's not really an official. It's more of a description of what was happening than necessarily what you would put on the invitation, right? And typically they had a format where they were going to celebrate a communion on a Sunday, okay, and they would spend Thursday, Friday, Saturday preparing people to then take the communion. And the way of doing that, like was to kind of do lots of preaching that would result in people having, like basically purging their souls, right, and repenting of their sins, so that when they came to the table on Sunday, they would come as repentant, folks, okay? And so what happens at Cane Ridge is you have, and it grows beyond Presbyterian community. So there's Methodists and Baptists there too, not just as participants, but preachers. And they do have like a big tent that has preachers there. But more than that, preachers are setting up stands kind of in the woods near where this church, where this meeting house is. And so they're setting up stands, they're preaching on top of stumps, okay? And there's people that also there's a lot of folk singing that's happening.
Are there food trucks or like
no food trucks?
This sounded like Bonnaroo.
It is, but no, seriously, it is. It becomes very festivalish. We know that there are people that come with like carriages and are essentially camping. So your example is actually not that far off, because word gets around.
Was the traffic pretty bad?
They say that it becomes loud enough with people responding that people can hear it a couple of miles away.
Wow.
Which. Yeah, Bonnaroo-ish, sort of.
For sure.
I think there are some differences, but
maybe.
Yeah, there's some differences. But like seriously, think about this as like a festival atmosphere.
Yeah.
really is significant, because there are people that are fully engaged in it. There's also people that are just there to like check it out. Like there's a huge crowd of people there, and there's stuff going on, and people kind of are curious and they want to see what's happening. And this is really a phenomenon of that period of time. There's like a 15-year window there that these sorts of things, and that carries in. Like our tradition still had that memory. Like I grew up in a church that had gospel meetings or the sort of revivalist sort of things growing up, but they're very different than what was happening there. Okay,
I mean that legitimately sounds like something fun. Like I would want to go do that.
Oh yeah, very much so.
And hang out with all those people and listen to the preaching. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, and it was a very passionate form of preaching and stuff. Yeah. And we should say, like, there's some stuff that we need to kind of speak about here. Okay, so here's the deal. Now, keep in mind, Kentucky. I've read that the highest populated city in Kentucky at that time, well, I think Lexington or Louisville one was 180,000. No, 1,800 people.
Go.
Okay, so this is, I mean, we're really talking about frontier towns. Okay, this is small town, right? But guess how many people came, they think, to the Cane Ridge revival?
I have no idea. I'm going to guess like 10,000 people since you say it like
Okay, so 10,000 is like the low bottom number.
Oh, really?
Some numbers are as high as 30. I think the best sort of counts are around 20,000 people.
Where did they come from?
Like all over. People came from all over to be a part of this thing. Okay, so about several thousand people come to this site. So much so that by the time on Sunday that when they actually have the communion thing, they've set up tables inside the church for this. Mm-hmm. Okay, and they have to do it like several times. Now everybody doesn't participate in communion because that really was the Presbyterian Church's sort of event.
Sure.
Okay, and lots of people from other traditions aren't going to participate in that, but. And I think at this point still would even be allowed to participate in that. But basically you can just see like this is crazy. Now here's the other deal. Now I want to be really careful about the way that we describe what happens at the revival besides that. Okay. Because there's stuff that will sound like modern Pentecostalism. Okay. But you need to know, because we haven't been looking at all those kinds of movements as we've gone. But those are really, it would be anachronistic to read that into it. Okay, like modern Pentecostalism is something that really comes in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Okay, in the early 20th century, there's a revival out in L.A. That kind of, creates some of those kinds of patterns. And so it's not that. In fact, the people don't really have a pattern for what's happening. But there are. The only way I can say it is that there are these ecstatic spiritual experiences that people have there. Mm-hmm. The most common one is people falling down, okay? Like they pass out, essentially, okay? So they're there, somebody's preaching, and in their conviction to what's happening, they shriek, mm-hmm. and then they fall over. And you kind of imagine this because there's stuff that modern Pentecostalism has those kinds of things, okay? But it's not within that tradition. This is something a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And this is very, I mean, their estimates of some 800 people or so do that over the course of this Cane Ridge thing. There are also like that thing where people are just like crying out, like that was a real deal. Okay, so this is not just people sitting and calmly listening to the preacher and going amen, every mm-hmm. once in a while. People are so convicted of their sins or what they've received in the gospel that they cry out often. Okay, that's why they're able to be heard for a couple of miles.
Yeah.
Okay, because people can hear like this is loud. I mean that's why people, it's a spectacle. Like people come and they see what's happening and participate in it. It's really a strange thing. There are reports of another thing where like people are kind of jerked around and are sometimes even to where they like sound they are grunting and they sound like a dog barking.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was kind of amazing.
That was kind of weird. Yes.
That there's enough people left 2 miles away that weren't at this thing to hear someone screaming.
Yes,
Like,
that's a
who
good
are these
point.
people that aren't there
Yeah,
that are
that's
2 miles away?
That's a really good point. I don't know. It's like real
It's
stubborn.
like they
people
emptied
outside,
the whole
yeah.
state. Where's everybody?
Yeah,
What's
where's
everybody else
everybody
doing?
That is right. So
Wow. Okay, so
and then there's one more. There's one more like they call exercise that's happening
Yeah.
in this place, and that's and Barton Stone like refers to this a lot later of people laughing and singing,
okay.
like where they just are uncontrollably laughing, and then also just kind of burst out in song. Like so, somebody's preaching and somebody else, on the third row just.
Are you sure
starts-
this wasn't Bonnaroo? Everything that you said
It still sounds
like a
I know, that's why I was kind of smiling when you said that. I was like, it's about to sound more like it. Yeah, do all this stuff.
Oh man,
But
that's great.
Well, was
this spontaneous stuff happening,
Yeah.
or was there like groups of people that were already doing that kind of thing that came and then they?
No, I don't think there's very much of that going on now. This revival, it had happened. It is happening in some of these other revivals. Okay. So I'm certain that part of what happens is people experience something like that in a revival somewhere, and then they come and then they themselves do it.
Yeah.
But it's really mysterious. I always, and when I read accounts of the Cane Ridge revival, okay, or communion season, it kind of blows my mind because it's so different from my experience. And when I think of it as being something that was really foundational to our movement, okay, it's remarkable how distant it seems.
Yeah.
I mean, we can just very, very flatly say that's not the kind of thing that we're really known for.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to me to read those kinds of accounts. It had a profound effect on a lot of people, and it was even Barton Stone. I mean, later on, there are people that are kind of questioning, like, what were is there excessive stuff going on there? But Barton Stone still, even as an old man, like looks back on that very fondly, and that experience profoundly shapes him. Okay. And I think it's really important that we have that experience in our history, particularly. And this gets us right to where I wanted to talk about with Campbell. Okay, so Campbell's restoration movement. Okay, his turn in this stuff was really about the revelation of ideas. You know what I'm saying? It was about the discovery of ideas, and we talked about how sometimes he was like he can be critiqued as being overly rational, and I think there's more to him than that. But I do think it's fair to say that the genesis of Alexander Campbell's movement was his rationality. Okay,
that's one thing we're kind of known for. So we kind of, I would say...
a little cerebral. And,
Yeah, we have a lot of scripture study.
Logical,
and stuff like that, sure.
Yeah, and that's there. But with Barton Stone, it's almost like the genesis of his movement was different. Now, I think both of them had passion. I think both of them had intellect, and I think they were, I think they both had a lot of the same, obviously found a lot of commonality with each other, okay? But I think it's significant to think about where the genesis of their movement came from, right? Like where the starting point was. And just as we think we can trace the starting point of Campbell in this like rationality and the this kind of common sense realism of Locke, all this stuff, the Lockean Enlightenment, all that kind of thing. I don't think that's where we start with Barton Stone. Okay, I think it starts with the experience, the revivalist experience of the Holy Spirit, and the freedom of that, because he kind of walks away from that with understandings. Okay, and he is already processing rationally some ideas. Okay, but he comes away from it with some experiences there that they're formative. They shape in the way that they shape some of the things that he can allow himself to think, and kind of won't allow himself to think later, right? Like he thinks to himself, first of all, that this thing was not happening in the domain of any particular church, right? And so Barton Stone remains for years very open to these other traditions and to God's working in them, because he has this sense that the Holy Spirit just works where the Holy Spirit wants to work. There's the sovereignty of God at work there. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's kind of because what you're saying is it was like an ecumenical get together, right? There were a lot of different traditions, and he got to experience a little bit of each of those and see God working in them, right?
Yeah,
so he was kind of convicted.
That's very
the
true.
right word. That's the right word.
Well, okay, so I'm balking on that word a little bit. Okay, and here's
not the right word.
So when I think of ecumenism, okay, and I think of myself as being ecumenical in a lot of ways. I think of that as being all of the different groups kind of retain their group identity, okay, and then they come to the table and they're kind of doing something cooperative together, but they are retaining their individual identities in some ways. Okay? I think Barton Stone was more like, he is your melting pot guy. He just thinks, regardless of to him, it's more that regardless of the individual identities, the Spirit is at work where the Spirit wants to be at work at. And he's just very, very reluctant to be restrictive about that. He's very reluctant to suggest that somebody with some other conclusions is that the Holy Spirit can't work in that person. He just won't do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that revival was it more like a melting pot? We're all here.
Yeah. It was Presbyterian. It was in the Presbyterian.
The Lord's Supper part of it, right? The communion.
Yeah. I think perhaps besides that, they're definitely preachers of different types. Okay, and certainly congregants of different types too. It's also here's another part of it too. Think about this element. It's going to be several years later. The Cane Ridge revival happens in 1801. Okay, Barton Stone is not going to come to his firmest conclusions about the importance of immersion. Okay, Anabaptist kind of conclusions that he needs to be baptized again. That's 1806 for him. Okay.
Later.
Yeah, it's a little bit later. Okay, well, let me think about this for a little bit, right? What does that mean? Well, he believes in the importance and that baptism is scriptural. He believes that is the thing to teach. He will not, he comes to a place where he teaches that firmly. Okay? But he has had these powerful experiences of the Spirit of God before that. Okay? So you can imagine that, right? You can kind of say he becomes reluctant to kind of invalidate somebody else's spirituality on the basis of the nature of their baptism. And so he's kind of in a different place than maybe Campbell would be a little bit later.
That's interesting.
Yeah, right. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I've had this experience in talking with people about baptism, and especially the idea about rebaptism. Somebody that was baptized and later they want to kind of, they feel like they didn't really know. And one of the challenges of that is that when you're baptized, or when you're baptized again, there's something about it that is almost invalidating to your Christian experience before that time. You know what I mean? You have to say, well, I wasn't really Christian before I did that. You know what I mean? And that becomes, especially for people who have been parts of churches for a long time, they consider themselves to be practicing the faith, and then they come to different conclusions about baptism, and they would recognize, this is something that I need to do. I need to be baptized, but they would very much balk at saying all these things that I did before weren't part of my Christian experience. And I think Barton Stone's actually in that kind of vein, in some ways. The idea, or the concept that our ways of coming to our conversion sometimes is rational and mental and logical, and sometimes it's experiential. And in fact, often what it is a mixture of all those things. Much more than we admit. I think our coming to Jesus, I think the Lord just uses all of that, right? I think some of the stuff that was more prior in Campbell's work and some of the stuff that was more prior in the genesis of Barton Stone's movement. I think the Lord is at work in all that, okay? And I think churches should be full of all that. We need people that have the intellectual rigor of an Alexander Campbell, right? But we also need people that have the experiential kind of passion of Barton Stone. And I think one of the things that made this movement flourish is that it had the kind of both ends of the strand, right? What happens is that, so Stone kind of grows out of that, okay? And then he begins refining, out of the experiences he's had, he begins refining his ideas, okay? Which is
that
almost...
makes sense for his kind of, more passionate kind of...
Yeah, he's making sense of it and teasing out. And I want to be clear that he's doing that and is very well known for doing that with a very much an attentiveness to the scriptures. Okay, I see that Mr. Jackson here is involved. He said, yeah. Someone said that Stone and his followers were all heart and no head, whereas Campbell and his followers were all head and no heart. And it's not accurate, but it does tend to describe their different approaches. Yeah, it's very much so. So those caricatures are helpful because they point out the different. I think those caricatures are helpful in that they illuminate the gifts that each side kind of brought to it.
Caricatures.
They're caricatures, right?
They're not 100% accurate, but they kind of...
That's right.
Bring out the differences. And
they may point to where the ideas came from, okay? But I would say that they become... that both of them are very attentive to the other side as they're developing it, right? So Campbell is definitely open to reevaluating his ideas based on the experiences of the church as they're growing and maturing, right? Like he has to go through that. He has to go through that process. We've launched this new movement. Well, what actually happens to it when it's out in the world, right? Whereas Stone is like, well, we've had these experiences, but we need to really hold these experiences up to the light of Scripture and kind of walk through what it really means and how do we discern like these two things together, right? I mean, I think those both work. I think those are both they're methodologically different, okay, but I think they're both useful strands, and I think the church works best when we have both of them. Okay.
So is that what happened? Did these two guys?
Okay, so let's talk about
yeah.
No, I don't know if Campbell would. I'm trying to think if they ever met. I kind of the I think they did have some meeting, but they. Let's back up a little bit. Let's trace a little bit more of Stone's journey to kind of get us to where he and Campbell, where they come together. Okay.
Okay.
So eventually everybody leaves Cane Ridge, right? Like everybody goes home, all those people, and they spend a couple of days, picking up cups and things like this, right?
Surely.
But the smoke clears, and this new movement, this revivalist movement, is kind of aflame. Okay, and Stone really, I would say that his immediate passion is following an unrestricted Christianity. Okay. And so he finds that some of the structures that he's a part of, he finds them too restrictive. Because some of his Presbyterian brethren at this point are resistant to this revivalism. They're like, what are you guys out there barking in the woods for? I would have some concerns, right?
Sure,
I think, and even people that want to be in good faith with him are like, is there any... Yeah. He's like, what do you mean? Like, okay, so for instance, we talked about how like Stone wants to become a minister. Well, he has to go through this credentialing. Well, he's like, people, and then this thing is something like Cane Ridge happens, and he's like, and some of his people in his group are like, hey, who's actually checking to make sure that the people that are preaching are qualified to do that?
Yeah.
And the answer is nobody. Like nobody's doing that, right? And so. That bothers some of his cohorts.
Yeah.
Stone sees that as what he calls partyism, which isn't as fun as it sounds like. Partyism is actually no fun.
Yes.
Yeah. He sees that as being this kind of sectarianism that is restrictive to what he's looking, and he's the guy that's saying, look, y'all, that may have not gone like anybody like we planned for it to, but that was the Spirit of God at work. And other people were like, yeah, but who's like actually check? Well, you can see how he has some resistance to that, right? And so he and some of his cohorts that are really convicted by this there at Cane Ridge, they form a new group. They basically splinter off and form what is called the Springfield Presbytery. Okay. And a presbytery, is different than a Presbyterian church is like a church, right? But the presbytery is usually like a little regional group of churches, okay? And so they form a new presbytery, okay, which has its own kind of bylaws and all that kind of stuff.
Is it home churches or something like that, or?
Still think you're still mostly in the group of like whole church, like the whole Cane Ridge Church is going to become part of it, right?
Okay.
They're kind of keeping their church structures mostly, but it does have associated. There are people, yeah.
I thought they left the Cane Church. What? Wait.
The Cane Ridge is not the no. I'll have to think about the name of the presbytery they're part with. But the whole the Cane Ridge Church is part of a presbytery, a larger network of churches.
Asking, what are you
yes,
doing?
yes,
Cane
yes,
Ridge
yes.
People are all together.
Yes, that's right.
Gotcha.
And so Cane Ridge starts with some others, and they have this other group called the Springfield Presbytery. And
you could just do that in the Presbyterian Church. There's no like Presbyterian.
No, I mean, it's not easy, but they just leave. Yeah, they
just do it.
This is a frontier, man. They can do what they want. Yeah,
there's only 1,800 people there.
There's a lot. Like they're bending all kinds of rules. Okay, but that's what they want to do. They're not. He's not asking. When they want to form this thing, they're not really asking if it's okay to do that. They're just doing it. Yeah. And in fact, what happens is that. Actually, the name of that other one was in this document that I gave you earlier.
I think it was Springfield or Spring.
Springfield is actually the one that they form. That's the new one. Okay. But we'll get to it here in just a second. Let's see here.
Oh, it's gone. I gotta find it.
The Synod of Kentucky. That was it. The Synod of Kentucky is the one that they leave and form this new. All right. Anyway. There's structures on structures, right? Kind of got your Russian nesting doll kind of thing going on here. But at any rate, what they do is they form the Springfield Presbytery, okay? And that's in 1803. So this is only a couple of years after Cane Ridge, okay? And let's do a little math on this, right? Because you got to get a picture of who this Barton Stone is at this point. What do we say? He's born in 1772. Okay, so if he's how old of a guy are we talking about here?
You said 1802?
1803. Yeah.
So 40, 30?
He's 30. Yeah, 30. He's 30 years old. Yeah, he's a pretty young guy. Okay, so this is like, and remember our context. This is frontier. This is like young buck on the frontier.
Yeah.
A whole new world. Okay, and not really inclined to follow the rules of the old world. Okay, this is kind of the thing that's going on here. And that spirit of so they form this group, and it's wildly successful. Okay, the Springfield Presbytery, because it can grow, like all these people that were at Cane Ridge are like, hey, did you know Barton Stone from Cane Ridge? They had that big experience, and this is the thing, people are reading about it in newspapers all over the country. The Cane Ridge deal. I mean, it's a big deal. It's a very, very big deal. And the people that are there, it's kind of like Woodstock, right? Like the people that are like, oh yeah, I was there. Yeah. There are lots of people that are like, I was at Cane Ridge when all that happened. And they cherish that memory, and so they find out that there's a new movement that's part of it, and they sign on pretty quickly. Okay, very quickly. In fact, it's so successful, and before long, they have a dozen churches, that are part of the Springfield Presbytery, and and Stone and some of his buddies they're kind of about 9 months later, okay, or 8 months later, I should say, 8 months later, in 1804. They're looking around and they feel like they need to kind of defend why they're doing what they're doing, and they begin to write an article about it and what it is that they really see as being kind of what they're about, okay? And at their meeting, they kind of butt their heads up against the wall, and they're like, well, we're trying to do all this like back to the Bible stuff, we're trying to be as simple and trying to really have this freedom, okay? But the thing that they keep butting their head up against is, but we feel like as we've done that, we've kind of accidentally become in charge of all these other people, and we don't want to be in charge because we don't feel like that would be biblical, right? For this small group of people here in Cane Ridge to be kind of making decisions for all these other little churches and these other disciples. You see kind of the quandary they're in, right? Like they're like writing their pen, like this is the stuff that we believe, and this is what we, and then they're holding it up and they're like, what even gives us the right to do this?
Yeah,
and they don't have a real good answer for that. Okay, so they say, let's just hold on all this stuff. They come back another month later, right? And they're like, we've all thought about this, we've prayed about it, and we think, and this is really amazing. This is amazing. Okay, at the real height of when this thing is become like really getting going, they have a lot of momentum, and they begin to see the success as the problem, because they believe that if all these people keep pointing to them, that they're going to become kind of the kings of this new religion, and that's the last thing they want. Mm-hmm. And so instead of writing, hey, this is the manual for all these churches, or this is our justification, this is the logic for what we're going to do, instead of writing that article that they had planned on writing, they write something that's almost the very opposite of that. Okay, and it's this document that's called the Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery, and I think it's brilliant. I really think this is brilliant. And this is the way it starts. It says, the Presbytery of Springfield, sitting at Cane Ridge in the county of Bourbon, being, through a gracious providence, in more than ordinary bodily health, which is a reference to how successful the churches are being. Okay, growing in strength and size daily, and in perfect soundness and composure of mind, but knowing that it is appointed for all delegated bodies once to die, and considering that the life of every such body is very uncertain, do make and ordain this our last will and testament in manner and form following, vis-a-vis. And then it says this: we will that this body die, be dissolved, and sink into union with the body of Christ at large. For there is but one body and one spirit, even as we are called in one hope of our calling. I mean, this is stunning, right? They say we're kind of at this place. We are in sound mind. We are a very healthy movement. We are a strong movement, right as we are right now. And because of that, we're dissolving. I want you to just think for a second about how crazy gutsy that was. That's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. They're right at the place. This is something that happens so rarely in human history, that someone gains power and then steps away from it.
Yeah. So what they could have done, right, is just say, these are all of our ideas, like you were saying, and now if you're a part of our movement or whatever, you got to do X, Y, Z, right? And they just kind of did the opposite.
Here's where you sign on for membership. I mean, they could have.
Yeah.
This could have been a recruiting pitch.
Yeah.
And it is, but it's a pitch for an idea instead of an organization.
Yeah.
Which is a way of saying we want these ideas to live, even if our power is not part of it.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that is such a bold and significant step. And in fact, almost everything, the first few items in this list are about stepping away from the power of the people that are writing it. You know, like, so the next one is, we will that our name of distinction with its reverend title be forgotten, that there be but one Lord over God's heritage and his name one. We will that our power of making laws for the government of the church and executing them by delegated authority forever cease, that the people may have free course to the Bible and adopt the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus. We will that candidates for the gospel ministry henceforth study the Holy Scriptures with fervent prayer and obtain license from God to preach the simple gospel, with the Holy Ghost sent down from heaven, without any mixture of philosophy, vain deceit, traditions of men, or the rudiments of the world, and let none henceforth take this honor to himself, but that he is called of God as was Aaron. We will that the Church of Christ resume her native right of internal government, that her candidates for the ministry is to their soundness in the faith, acquaintance with experimental religion, gravity and aptness to teach, and admit no other proof of their authority but Christ speaking in them. We will that the Church of Christ look up to the Lord of the harvest to send forth laborers into his harvest, and that she resume her primitive right of trying those who say they are apostles and are not. Which is a way of saying that, like, we, this kind of presbytery as a superstructure, are not going to be approving who is worthy to preach or not. Instead, and that's counterculture, right? Like, that's countercultural, particularly to the organization that they had been a part of. Yeah.
So there's strong arguments both ways, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, I mean, good arguments too. It's not just like,
man.
we've kind of grown up in this atmosphere where like we're all ministers, right?
Yeah, we assume
anyone,
that.
Yeah, we as a member of the Church of Christ, you're like an ordained minister in the eyes of like the law of the United States, right? You can marry someone. Where if you're Catholic or something, you have to be a priest, right, or something. You have to be ordained to marry people. So we're considered that, and the great thing about this is that now it takes the power structure of like the presbyters or the bishops or whoever, and it says each church can kind of run itself, and they don't have to. You don't have to have like this body of people telling you what to do that maybe you don't believe or trust, or maybe doesn't have your best interest at mind or the heart of Christ and everything else.
Well, yeah, and very clearly, what this is kind of an amazing language to me. Okay, let every church try their candidate for the ministry as to the soundness of the faith, acquaintance with experimental religion, which is are they familiar with these kind of experiences of faith? Yeah, gravity and their aptness to teach. Like, how good are they? Are they winsome in their teaching, I guess. And then admit no other proof of their authority but Christ speaking in them. I think that is profound. Like, ultimately, the church should look and say, well, is the person preaching, do I hear the voice of Christ in that word?
And that's where it gets hard, right?
Super subjective.
That's the other side of it, right? Because it opens the door for all kinds of people to say what they want and be preachers if they get a group of people that are like, hey, that guy's got something.
And and Stone knows it's dangerous.
Yeah.
I think he would admit that that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Okay? But I think what he would say is it's dangerous and we're just going to have to deal with it.
Yeah.
Like, that's a response. He goes on to say, right, like, it's the primitive right of the church of trying those who say they are apostles and not. So he's really essentially saying we have to take on that responsibility for ourselves in the church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's look at, Jordan says, and this is a really good point, that is the difference between the start of a cult and a non-cult, what the leaders do when all the power is in their hands. Yeah. Right? This could have become a super cult.
Yeah.
Yeah, like really cultish.
Very much
Who knows what could have happened. And then RH has something else. The last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery is often considered the second most important document in the early Restoration movement, second only to the Declaration and Address written by Thomas Campbell in 1809.
Yeah. And I would say that part of the reason, like Campbell's is more, it contains more of the logic of it.
Yeah.
Right? It contains
Did we read some of that last week?
Yeah, that was the one a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. These two things are like very, and that's why I wanted to read. I wanted to read a couple. You need to hear some of these things.
This one's shorter and easier to read.
It's definitely easier to read. Well, and you get to the meaty parts of it real quickly. Yeah. I think so too. But there's also some other stuff too. I want to read a couple other little sections of it too because it's pretty significant, right? Like, we will that the people henceforth take the Bible as their only sure guide to heaven. As many as are offended with other books which stand in competition, it may cast them into the fire if they choose. For it is better to enter into life having one book than having many to be cast into hell. Well, that's pretty significant, right?
Yeah.
I love this line. We will that preachers and people cultivate a spirit of mutual forbearance, pray more, and dispute less. And while they behold the signs of the times, look up and confidently expect that redemption draweth nigh. Boy, I love that. That preachers and people cultivate a spirit of mutual forbearance. In other words, we kind of we give each other some slack.
Yeah.
Like we take each other in good faith and cut each other some slack and give grace and mercy to each other. Pray more and dispute less. I keep thinking of the Hamilton song that Aaron Burr sings.
Smile more, talk less.
Yeah. No, it's the other way around.
Talk less,
smile more.
Yeah,
that's it, right? Don't let them know what you're against or what you're for. That's for you Hamilton fans out there. I see you, Celia Bond. I don't know if she's really a Hamilton fan or not.
If not, we need to get her over here.
I don't know if she wants to watch that. At any rate, but yeah, his instead of talk less and smile more, it's pray more and dispute less. Yeah. And I think that paragraph right there. I mean, pray. RH, if you're looking for a new tattoo, that'd be a good restoration tattoo for you right there, my brother. That's a motto for our age, right?
Yeah.
To grow in forbearance with each other. I mean, In this, and he's right. Like this is one of our like two real founding documents. I think it's very fair to say that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the spirit in it is, hey, we've got to find ways to get along, and we need to be more about giving ourselves to God in prayer, and less about kind of trying to win contest of arguments.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I mean, there's a place for all of that stuff, right?
Sure.
But if that's all you're doing, and there's an imbalance, you got to swing it the other way a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, that's the one thing I noticed about this document. We're kind of most movements swing, and in retrospect, maybe they swing a little bit too far.
Mm-hmm.
And in this one, like especially the part where he's like, "Throw your books away, just have the Bible,"
Well, he doesn't compel people to do it.
No.
He says, if you're offended by those other books, then get rid of them.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what we ended up doing, right? I mean, we ended up just tossing out everything but the Bible, and there's some good stuff that has been printed over the 2,000 years since Jesus.
Sure. And he's going to print some more stuff.
Yeah, and he writes books.
So,
right?
So Stone. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, no, I'm just saying. It just seems like sometimes in a movement you throw the baby out the bathwater, or you can tend to like every movement I think tends to kind of swing the pendulum a little bit too far, and then you kind of come back to central later, maybe with more refinement. I don't know. That's just kind of that was my first thought when I read that, but
So let's pick up a little bit here, okay? Because what happens from this? Okay, this is 1804. Okay, remember this is a couple of years before Alexander Campbell is even. He's still in Scotland.
Yeah.
At this point, he's at Glasgow studying.
1809 is when he came out. 12 or something.
Yeah, 6 and 7 I thought, but yeah, he's coming. Yeah. Thomas and Alexander 6 and 7 I think. So what happens here in this process, though? But in the next few years, right? It's going to be the next 5 years. They're going to be here and be established in the States.
You think they've heard about this thing even in Scotland?
Not yet, but it's coming. Well, they probably heard. They might have heard about Cane Ridge. I mean, that's definitely a possibility. Now, their particular branch of Presbyterianism at that point was anti-secede. It was kind of against the this revivalism stuff. Was kind of that wasn't up on their.
Well, that's because they were worried. Remember, they were worried that the dad was worried that the son would reject them and vice versa. Because their new beliefs.
So their group wasn't. Yeah, that's right. So there's this. What happens though is that he goes through a process. A couple of years later, he's going to be baptized. He kind of takes on that subject of, and even his. Some of his experience of the revivalism comes into that. Like, this is a great way of actually seeing some of his kind of the tension between the revivalism and the logic of scriptures, because one of the things that he experienced is that people will come to these revivals and they cry out for the mercy of God for like days on end. And he's like, why don't people, when they cry out, why don't they experience? And he's like, well, maybe it's because we don't tell them to be baptized. Like, that's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so he kind of is like, again, you can kind of see, right? Like, he's taking this experience and he's holding it up to what he's reading in scripture, and he's no academic slouch. Like, he knows his Greek, he's Stone's more when we talk about Campbell being the intellectual center and Stone being kind of the heart center, it's not as clear as that. I mean, they're both very smart, and he may not. I don't think he has this. I mean, the same intellectual rigor as Campbell does for sure. Okay, but he's got chops. Okay, he ends up taking on some similar paths. Like, begins to do his own like newsletter. Okay.
Does he subscribe to the Millennial?
Absolutely,
Harbinger?
they're definitely reading each other's stuff. Yeah.
Do they guest write on each other's?
They have moments where they have quotes or kind of reports of what's happening, and like they're kind of stuff.
I guess are we getting to this? Like, how in the world do these two separate people come and merge, and we have this one movement?
Well, okay, so first of all, they both kind of have this like rebellious spirit, right? Like, where they're bucking somebody. They both have this like, you're not the boss of me kind of stuff going on, right? And so Campbell is. And so they both have their antenna up for anybody else doing that, right? Oh, there's this other group over there saying, kind of withdrawing from these other groups and saying they only want it to be simple. I mean, it's just.
And they used to be Presbyterians.
Yeah, they have some kind of. Yeah,
so they have a little bit in common there.
Yeah. Now he doesn't have the same Baptist roots as Stone has. Like, I mean, Campbell
right.
Campbell is Presbyterian and then goes into some Baptist churches for
Yeah.
a period of time and then
Forgot
comes
about
back to it. Yeah, and Stone doesn't have the same thing, but he does have. They do share this like
Yeah.
Presbyterian. Which turns out our structure, like our structure is Presbyterian. We have like boards of elders, like it's a very Presbyterian sort of structure. Okay?
Presbyter is elder. Right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So they just where they differ from the Presbyterian polity or structure polity is what we talk about, like governance, like how the church is governed. And where they differ is they don't have the like they're much more radically congregational. Okay, which. So that each, like you hear that in what Stone is claiming right there, is that each church needs to make these decisions for themselves.
Right, yeah.
So they're kind of this mix. They're kind of this mix of some of the stuff that they had kind of gathered from some of the Baptist churches, and then also there's this radical independence.
Is that kind of the difference between being a denomination and being like non-denominational?
Yeah.
Is that you don't have like this governing body that's kind of
over there's
every one of your churches.
some of the structural stuff. I think that would be a fair way. That's definitely part of the way they understand it. Yeah. Okay. There's also just the branding.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Which is a thing, right?
We fought that for a long time.
Yeah.
We're not a denominational church, right?
Right.
But I mean, that makes it make more sense. Like why?
Sure.
You were taught that growing up.
Yeah. That congregational thing is a part of it, and there is like this deep resistance to somebody else telling you what to do, and that's just like, I mean, that is their religious movement. It's also like good old Americanism. I mean, it's some of their, it's some of the ties of like the American culture that's coming to fruition in everybody. All right, so let's. I wanted to check. We got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
I want us to go just a little further. Basically. In the next 15 years or so, those movements, though, they're going to become more closely tied. And when we say that the movements are becoming more closely tied, it's significant to recognize, I think it's really significant to recognize that, like when we talk about the official players, like the writers and the leaders that are, like that's one thing, but like what's actually happening in some place in rural Kentucky in that moment, it was probably very different, right? So what you have are churches that are like there's no membership, right? There's no like everybody send in your cards. This is the official church membership of the But what happens is you really have these churches and their ministers and their believers inside the churches, the people, the disciples that are being influenced. And some of them that are being influenced by Stone find that they're also being influenced by Campbell, right? And so it kind of becomes, and there's other people too. Elias Smith. There's some other names. There are other names that we may talk about a couple of these next week. That are also okay. In fact, there's this guy named Raccoon John Smith. Okay, and he actually becomes the guy who has a meeting with Stone on behalf of Campbell. Okay. And at the end, they kind of talk through some ideas. Well, what do you think about this? Well, we kind of are saying this. Well, what do you think about it? Well, it's kind of similar, but we're also... And they kind of go through some things. And then there's this moment at the end where, like, Raccoon John Smith comes up and he, like, in a very formal way, extends the right hand of fellowship to Stone. And they come and they shake hands. No, to Stone. Smith is speaking on behalf of
Campbell. Oh, okay.
He's speaking on behalf of Campbell, and so he is kind of like that part of the movement. And Stone, and they kind of shake hands and embrace, and then now we have
like cousin churches.
Now we have the Stone Campbell movement. Okay. Now we have what we call the Restoration movement. That's kind of and that's in the 30s. I think 32 or something like that. Okay. And they had been kind of flirting with it for a while. They had met like through December of 31. And then on January 1st of 32, they had this kind of like last final thing where they embrace each other and I think sign an agreement together.
And this Stone Campbell movement is kind of like an anti-establishment church kind of movement.
Yeah, it's kind of just like... Well, yes, but it's 30 years old at this point.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. I mean, it's 31 years since Cambridge.
Yeah.
Well, and that's exactly the problem.
Yeah.
And they get that, right? Now, here's the deal. Remember, Stone was 15 years older than Campbell. And so he doesn't live to see some of the conflicts, especially building up to the Civil War, that Campbell does. Okay? He dies about 20 years before Campbell does. Campbell dies in 1866. In 1844, I believe, 1845, right in there, about 20 years, just a little over 20 years before Campbell, about 15 years before the Civil War, Stone dies.
Yeah.
Okay, he actually was living in Illinois at that point. Okay, would you like to know why he moved to Illinois? This is great.
Illinois. I would like to know, but I can't.
Fascinating thing. Okay, so get this. Okay, so he lives in Kentucky. This is 1840s. Okay, his wife's parents dies, and she is bequeathed property, including slaves. Okay, remember we said that this had happened to Campbell as well. He inherited some through his wife's family.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it happens to Stone as well, and he is already an abolitionist. But Stone's pretty full blown abolitionist.
Yeah.
Okay, and they want to free the slaves, but legally they're not allowed to, because Kentucky being a slave state, they were the way that they had been deeded in the was like to a trust. Okay, that came with the property. It was kind of the formal will document that they of the inheritance, and so they moved so that they could move to a free state, so that they could emancipate their slaves.
What were?
And so that's what they did. Yeah.
I just what would you be thinking to be someone's parents, knowing your son-in-law is an abolitionist?
Yeah, that's right.
And leave him slaves in your will.
Well, that's part of the system, right? Part of the problem of these systems is that they entangle people oppressed, and the oppressor is themselves entangled in it in some ways too. And Stone, there's just no way around it. They say, look, we can't continue to live here and legally free these slaves. Yeah. And so they pick up and move, for the purpose of intentionally do that. And I think it's important to know. It is, like we said last week with Campbell, it's significant to me that both of the founders of this movement in that moment in the South made those choices to emancipate. Any rate, Stone is an incredible person. He really believed in the unity of the church, and he believed. There's this one article he writes where he talks about the unity. He says you can have unity of. There are these 4 levels, and one of them is the unity of you're forced into it. You just make everybody do the same thing, and then there's a unity of everybody tries to do it with the Bible. They have their own thing. But he kind of even progresses past that. I think he has a unity of baptism is maybe the next one. But his 4th level of unity is the unity of the Spirit. And he just says in the end, even if you have unity based on the Bible, unless you have unity based on the Spirit, that is the Spirit of that Bible, your unity is not going to be full. You're going to still find things to fight about and argue about. But if the whole of the church is really devoted to living by the Spirit of God, then we're going to find ways of kind of living together, and I think that's just really profound. It's a really beautiful sentiment. Yeah. Anyway, hey, like we said before, if you, I would highly recommend you get on and read particularly that one document.
Yeah, it takes Last Will and 10 minutes to read. It's not really long. It's not written in today's vernacular, so it's a little bit hard to pick. But
it's better than the Declaration of Address in that language, know. But I think you would be inspired by it. So look up the Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery. Okay. And I know that last word is hard to spell, but once you start, Google will help you. Okay, I think you get into Last Will and Testament of Springfield, and it'll show this thing. It's a pretty significant document. And there are lots of free versions where you can read that one. It's not nearly that long either, you know.
Yeah, right.
So I would encourage you to do that. Campbell is surely a driving force, and so is Stone, and then the force that brings them together, and it's not necessarily easy. Like they're different groups. Like they're kind of hashing stuff out for years and years and years, you know. And that's good. That's a beautiful thing.
We're still doing that.
They're trying to find ways of making it work.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty significant quest. And we're still trying to do that.
Jordan, agree with you.
What's she say?
100%.
Yeah, that's right. And now it's not everybody. We should say that's not universal. Like there are other people that are stubbornly trying to defend it. But I do take comfort in these two leaders were trying to figure out ways of moving away from it.
Yeah.
You know? So okay, all right. Well, grace and peace to you, and I hope you guys have a great night. Thanks for being a part of our class.
Thanks.
It's been fun. Thanks, Rylan.
Yeah, it's been good.
I'm glad you're here.
Me too.